Welcome to Business Owner Tales from the Trenches, the podcast for business owners who want to see around corners and thrive financially. Your host is Carr, CEO and business owner at CornerCap. Tune in every other week for lessons learned from the trenches of entrepreneurship, business successes, and financial independence. Here's Cannon.
Welcome to the show. Cannon Carr and Claudia Betting are with you. Claudia, we have a great guest with us today. And by way of quick background, when we recorded this episode, we went into it saying with the theme, what can entrepreneurs learn from leaders who've run public companies and large divisions of private companies? And we certainly talk about that today with our guest. But as an added benefit and kind of a neat discovery, we spend a lot of time talking about how do strong leaders that face high growth situations, how do they lead their teams through high growth, high uncertainty, and high periods of high change? And our guest talks through some great methodologies to help entrepreneurs do just that. So Claudia, why don't you tell us who our guest is today?
Yeah, today we have Chris Walters on the podcast. Chris started his career at McKinsey, where he took his experience to become an entrepreneurial CEO, and he now helps businesses achieve rapid market expansion and revenue growth. Throughout his career, he's partnered with executives from Fortune 100 and private equity businesses to transform them. His recent tenure with Vantax led to a successful sale, and he has now become CEO of Pluralsight, a company that aims to educate businesses and individuals on how to develop and utilize their technological skills.
It's a great episode. And as you listen to it, keep three things in mind. The first one is we asked Chris, how should a new leader to an organization experiencing change spend the first year? And he turns it on its head and he talks through something he calls the reset. And he'll walk you through what he means by that. Secondly, as you plan over the next 3 to 5 years for your organization, there's a phrase people often use, fail fast, right? Minimize wasted resources, accelerate your decisions. Chris has a really effective methodology that he used when he was a consultant at McKinsey and has now taken it through many iterations with his corporate journey, and uses that methodology to basically help you accelerate by minimizing resources and having that high impact change you want to make. And third, listen to how he talks about once you get that place you're headed correctly defined, it's time to pivot, right? And it's time to scale for repeatable processes. And for entrepreneurs, that is often such a difficult transition to make because you have to undo you have to avoid making some mistakes that are often done. Chris will walk you through that. So it's a great episode with someone who's really experienced in leading organizations through change. Sit back and listen to this great episode with Chris Walters. Well, Chris, thanks for joining us on the program. We'll get to kind of our key subject about what entrepreneurs can learn from someone who's run a public company or several companies. But first, I thought we'd just pause for a moment. And, when we look at your career progression in advising companies and leading companies, you've been part professional executive, part entrepreneur, part change agent. How do you think about your role in leading these companies?
Yeah, so it's goes to my intellectual curiosity. I've always had fun working on a wide variety of types of problems and even across a variety of industries. And so I really like doing things that are highly growth oriented. And so that could be incubating a new business or accelerating the growth of an existing business, or it could be turning around a business that's really struggling. What's required to do each of those things is quite different, and that's part of the fun of it. But if I look at the things that I've done from an early age, right, I was exposed to entrepreneurship because my father owned multiple businesses. He was the designer and builder of sailboats, and it was a small company. Yeah. I was fortunate enough to be pulled into some of the discussions with his board members and learn about business very early on. And look, small, earlier stage businesses are it's a little more precarious, right, than when you get a little bit more large and established. And so I have fun with all types of businesses.
Yeah. Well, could we call you an entrepreneur? I mean, do you consider yourself an entrepreneur in some respects?
Yeah, without question. As I said, I've been involved in multiple businesses from very early stage. I do a fair bit of early stage investing because I like that portion of kind of the spectrum of business. I think the intellectual curiosity that I have coupled with the energy and the learning that is associated with engaging with early stage businesses is fun. And I would say one of the most fun stops in my professional journey was at Bloomberg. One of the businesses that was launched there was a government information business.
Yeah.
And it literally came from a clean sheet of paper where the co-founder and I had this idea that can we, build something for people who sell to the government or influence the federal government that would be a lot like the Bloomberg terminal is for the financial services market.
Yeah.
We went and talked to hundreds of potential customers and said, what are you happy with about what you're getting today, and what are you not so happy with? And then as we got further along, what if we delivered this to you? And from those conversations, right, created a product offering and built the team and launched the business. And now many would say it's one of the most influential, information providers in DC. And so that was a ton of fun, right? Building a team from nothing to there's hundreds of people involved in that business now, and it's you talk to anybody in DC who sells or influences the federal government, and almost everyone knows it.
Right. And so, well, right. You were innovating and building something within the Bloomberg system. And
Yes.
exactly what entrepreneurship is. So, well, love that. So you have done a lot, you've seen a lot, and I'm excited to bring that knowledge to our audience on this program then. So, and I'm curious, I know you just started with Pluralsight, but you're not new, you're no stranger to coming in to a new situation right at the top as a leader and have to institute change. I'm just curious, what does that first year look like? You don't have to talk about Pluralsight, but what does that first year often look like? What do you look to try to accomplish in year one? And what have you learned is too much to try to accomplish in year one?
I would say I always have to hold myself back on the too much point, because
Mm-hmm.
whenever you see, a challenge or an opportunity, right, you want to, do everything you can as fast as you can to get there. I would say our world moves at a pretty fast pace, and therefore business and industry, right, needs to adjust pretty quickly. And so in a situation where you're trying to change the performance trajectory of a business, I don't think about that journey in a year-long time frame. It's how do you reset, within 3 or 4 months where you're going. And so there are multiple elements of a reset. And it's funny because just this past week we were talking to the broader team at Pluralsight that I just joined about what the next quarter is going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
And the first part of it is let's understand what's going on today. Let's understand every aspect of what we're doing and what's working incredibly well and what's not working as well. And it
Mm-hmm.
sounds incredibly simple, but how do you do a heck of a lot more of what's working well and stop investing in some of the things that aren't working so well? So I would say the first part of it is a diagnostic of kind of what's happening in the business today. A second element of that assessment is really understanding customer needs and how you're delivering on customer needs, where I think, business, you can simplify it down to a pretty extraordinary extent by just saying, what do you really want to get a great outcome? You want to deeply understand customer needs and have a team that's incredibly fired up to go over deliver on those needs. And if you have those two things happen, in most cases, you get pretty strong performance. And
Yeah.
so, as I said, a second part of the assessment is understanding kind of how we're delivering on customer needs, what are the unmet needs, and then building a plan in terms of how you might address them. A third part of the assessment is the team. And
Yeah.
you heard me describe how it's somewhat simplistically look at business, but you need a team that's very excited to go over deliver for clients. Well, you need to understand engagement, understand culture. Are people excited about coming to work every day and delivering for clients? And
Mm-hmm.
if they're not, right, what are some of the refinements that you would make to the business? And so all of that assessment, right, over a few month period
Mm-hmm.
should come back with a perspective on, okay, so what refinements are we going to make to our strategy? And then the things that what associated with that we're going to invest in. And how do
Mm-hmm.
we refine the structure? Or how do we align our team, right, to go and deliver for customers? And so anyway, that's what the first 90 days will look like. And what I hope by the end of the first year is you're then starting to see, right, how that refinement, right, if you set up the right measurement and ongoing reporting approach, you can understand how you're executing on delivering that refined approach.
That's a great answer. So it's not like, right, you're not looking at it from a time standpoint. It's more as you're hitting these key milestones along the way, you can accelerate into change, right? So you can start finding where you want to be productive and change, where you're going to stop doing some things. And maybe last question there, how do you build excitement? How do you build trust quickly?
Yeah, It's a great question. It's often tricky, particularly when you're coming into situations where it's clear that there's some refinements that need to be made to the approach.
Yeah.
Because people often can expect material change, and they people generally don't want change, right? And so, how do you go into an environment where some change is required and have people feel comfortable? I would say, look, everybody has different approaches to doing this. Mine is one where I'm just incredibly transparent and
Mhm.
open about both who I am, how I think, companies should operate, how people should engage with me, and what we're going to be going through together, right? And I think the higher the level of transparency that you can provide, right, and the more you can connect with people across the organization where you're not, and in larger organizations, it's hard as you've got, I think the business I've just joined, we have about 1,700 people, right?
Mhm.
It's hard to build a personal connection with everybody, but my approach is I want to be completely accessible. I think my first couple days, it was daunting because I conveyed this approach of openness and interest in engaging very broadly. My personal rule is, if anybody in the company wants to talk to me, I'll find time. It may be at 6 o'clock on a or Sunday evening,
Right.
because my schedule's pretty slammed, but I'll always find time. And so when you create a culture or throw out to an organization that you're willing and interested to hear from people, guess what? They reach out. So my late nights over the last week was responding to the hundreds and hundreds of LinkedIn connections from team members and saying how excited they were, and me
Yeah.
responding to all of them, and the same thing for email and Slack messages. And so, anyway, you just try to create an environment where people feel like they can be heard.
That's awesome. So yeah, I love it. Transparency, build it together kind of mindset, and responsiveness, right? I mean, clearly you're making time for people, getting back to them, letting them know they're important. I think
Yeah.
those are great lessons. Well, all right. So let's pivot into what entrepreneurs can learn kind of from your journey there. And the first one, you alluded to the Bloomberg project, and I know so much of your career has been those projects that have led to growth and whatnot. So let me ask, when you start a project, do you begin with the end in mind? And as hitting the ground here, do you think most entrepreneurs and their efforts know what their end game is usually?
Uh, I think most entrepreneurs I've interacted with have a great understanding of the markets that they're operating in and some vision, right? But I would say there's a difference between vision and strategy, a really detailed strategy. And as businesses get larger, right, the clarity of what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to accomplish it and how you're trying to measure it is so important, right, to good execution. And so I would say most founders have a great understanding of the market, their customers, and a vision. When they get to the point of beyond the point of experimenting and things are really starting to work, right, where it often gets uncomfortable is how do you get a lot more rigorous in laying out the details of your strategy? How does
Mm.
that link to financial goals, operating metrics that link to those financial strategies, right? And even projects or programs and how you measure, right, your success of delivery.
But to round out that concept of, ultimately knowing where you're headed, do you think, is it important to have an exit strategy? Or maybe a better question is, when should you start forming that exit strategy? Assuming that, doing it by accident a week before it happens doesn't count, right?
I don't think it's required upfront to have an exit strategy. I would say that in terms of where you're going, it's often good to actually throw out, even if you haven't done all the analysis and had your team kind of do massive amounts of market analysis or build all the things that I described. It's great to start with the answer, and the answer doesn't need to be an exit strategy. It's where do I want my business to be in
Mm-hmm.
3 or 5 years? There was something that was yeah, I was taught when I was at McKinsey, which is a pretty phenomenal approach to problem solving, but it is incredibly uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I think I may have shared this story with you in the
You did.
past,
Yeah, I love it. Let's
but
go there. Let's go there.
but so my first study at McKinsey, the engagement manager, and for those who don't know McKinsey, big strategy consulting firm, works with lots of big businesses to help them grow and perform better. And so my first study, I'm coming out of University of Chicago, and I was really excited to go into the firm, and I get into a team room with our engagement manager and the rest of the team. And the engagement manager said, "Okay, here's a limited amount of information. Here's the client they're going to work with. Here's the problem they have. And so I want you to spend a day or two, and we're all going to get back together and you're going to share with me what the answer is. So basically, they threw out the problem, and in a day and a half or 2 days, we were going to get back together and all share our answer.
Okay.
And I vehemently objected. I said, this is ridiculous, right? Here's all the data and information that I would want to have even a moderately informed view. And he
Right.
pushed back pretty hard. And what you'll hear talked about extensively in McKinsey is hypothesis-driven problem-solving approaches. And the
Hmm.
challenge is the bigger and more complex the problem is, the more data you could amass, the more analysis you could do, and you can just get mired in all the details and miss kind of what the answer is. And so I learned over a 7-year period at McKinsey how to do that very well, which is kind of figure out what the end state is and have a hypothesis of what the answer is, and then figure out the much smaller set of things that you need to prove or disprove for that to be true. And the reality is that you'll never get it right the first time. And then if you go through a more rigorous strategy effort, you'll end up refining from that initial answer. And honestly, as you operate on an ongoing basis, some of the assumptions that you had are proven to be wrong. So what do? You
Right.
shift 10 degrees, right? But you're constantly iterating, but it's just a way more efficient way to solve big complex problems.
I love that answer because you're right. If you start too much in the data and you just do data analytics, there's logic, but you can get off track or you can go down the wrong path. What you're saying is, in this hypothesis-driven approach, you're pinpointing those key assumptions that are required for success, and you need to test them to find out are they the right assumptions or not. But it gets you focused on the important matters, I guess, is
Yeah,
how I would articulate. Yeah. Well,
that's
and I
exactly.
remember that was one of the first things we talked about. One of the first lessons, I think, was that concept of fail fast, where we talked about here, because in covering those assumptions, like you said, some of the assumptions are going to be wrong, but you'll find that out pretty quick if you're measuring it. And I think, in my words, I think one lesson is it's important to be able to accelerate your decisions to a solution.
Yes.
Um,
I think
and
it's a great way to articulate it. I would say accelerate your decision towards a solution. And there's two ways to figure out if you're on the right path. One
Mhm.
is you can actually do a whole bunch of analysis and research and gather data, and that's what typical larger firms and do with strategy studies. And the second thing, and most larger firms do this well, in addition, which is test, right? And what I think you referenced this, what you want to do is you want to test new ideas as quickly as you possibly can with as few resources as you can to figure out if those critical assumptions are valid, right?
Yeah.
Because often people they'll start with the total number of resources they need 3 years from now. Well, what do you really care most about? What are the minimum resources that I need and the minimum amount of time that I require to know that this is something that's going to work? Because if it works, I
Right.
want to do a lot more of it. If it doesn't, I don't want to spend any more money.
Want to stop on that one. So, well, that's so key. And do you see it hard for teams to actually implement that solution, or what kind of mindset's required to do that? How do you get teams willing to do that?
It's hard. And the reason why I say it's hard is because it goes against all of our instincts in terms
Yeah.
of approach to problem solving, right? So even in the current situation that I'm in right now, I think about my last week and my first conversations with many of the functional teams. And right, it's funny because I'm the one who hasn't been there the longest, and I have no idea what the right answer is. I have
Right.
some informed perspective, but I'm throwing out hypotheses, right, and asking the team to challenge it. And so it's an interesting exercise, but it's so counterintuitive and it's not comfortable for people. And so you do need some folks on your team that have some experience doing it. Or you
Mhm.
need to read about the, hypothesis driven problem solving approaches and learn and try to bring it yourself.
Well, it just to wrap that part up, it is clearly about leadership, right? Providing the leadership there to do that when people are not used to it. But it also must have an element of trust. It's okay to not know the answer. It's okay to look vulnerable or maybe even like an idiot, right? Um,
Yeah.
those are required.
It is. I think it's a challenge for me because I communicate. I was talking to one gentleman who's worked with me in a couple of different places, and I communicate with confidence, right? Most
Hmm.
people, they connect with leaders who have confidence in their direction.
Hmm.
That's He was just talking to one of my new team members, and he's like, make sure you understand. Look, Chris communicates with confidence, but he absolutely wants the debate. So like
Right.
bring it, right? And so it's an interesting balance as a leader because if you suggest you have no idea and you're not informed in any way, people are like, well, why is this person leading the organization?
Exactly.
But if you come across with too much conviction, then people won't challenge you. And the reality is you want to be able to throw out ideas that are informed and you want people to rigorously or vigorously challenge it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess periodically you formally get together, what, like every quarter or every week, or to retest those assumptions. How often how formal is that cadence?
Yeah, so what I would say, and I'll speak more about kind of like the beginning of a journey like I'm about to go through right now,
Yeah.
which is there's a lot of work that will be done because it's a decent sized organization over a quarter about what we're going to be doing and how we might
Hmm.
refine our focus. Right, they'll have pretty regular kind of check-ins, and with larger businesses, it's quite common, right? So my leadership team will check in with them, all of them, on a weekly basis, but pull them together at least bi-weekly. And with the broader organization, next level of leadership monthly, and the full organization quarterly. But you're sharing information all the time
All the
about
time.
your progress, right? That then allows you to refine your approach. You're
Hmm.
constantly, right? And you should be looking at information, data on operating metrics and your performance against critical milestones on things that you're delivering, customer feedback. You're looking at constantly and figuring out if you need to refine.
Yeah. Well, that lesson by itself is worth the price of admission. I love that hypothesis testing of assumptions, and it's a proven methodology. Takes leadership, takes trust. So, but accelerate decisions to solutions. Love that first concept. What else? What else comes to mind when you think, all right, what can an entrepreneur learn from someone who's run large organizations, often public?
Yeah. Well, so I won't take, I'll hold the public kind of comments for a second, but just I would say larger organizations, having worked a lot with smaller businesses through my investments and doing some things early stage. I think one of the challenges is what is required to actually figure out what the answer is to be successful in an early stage business
Hmm.
is often rapid ideation and pivoting across a number of different approaches, right? And so
Hmm.
you're trying to figure out what really has a effective product market fit. So what is something you can deliver that your customers will love, right? And so you're often ideating and testing and constantly refining to figure out what that is. Well, once you figure that out and you've got something that really works, then it's all about tightening things up. And when I say
Hmm.
tightening things up, it's how do you scale that, right?
Right.
And how do you scale that in a highly repeatable way? And so at the start, right, in the earlier stage and in smaller businesses, right, it's actually great to have lots of ideas thrown out all the time. And you want that in larger businesses as well, but you need more focus as you get larger on the things that are working best and tightening up every way that you go and execute and measure
Hmm.
your progress and refine your delivery of that thing, right? And
Hmm.
so that often isn't the natural instinct of entrepreneurs, right? Because
Hmm.
what got them there to find that kind of great thing, if they're still kind of focusing the bulk of their energy on incremental ideas versus scaling, uh,
Yeah.
and building highly repeatable, measurable processes that can take the business from 10 to 100 or 100 to 1,000, right? It's difficult.
Well, it's such a great point, and I see it all the time where like the founder or the key entrepreneur who has that vision, that idea, often just keeps tweaking, keeps refining, keeps perfecting. And you're right. At some point, you're saying when you get it right to a pretty significant degree, quit tweaking and start scaling. Is that
Yeah,
to
when I wouldn't
simplify
say
it?
it's not, I would say rather than tweaking, because you're always kind of tweaking that kind of core solution,
Yeah.
it's you have to be careful not to distract your team with
Yeah.
too many new ideas that are
New
not
ideas.
linked to that core solution, right? Because you should always be taking feedback from your customers and your team and refining to make what you do great, make it even better.
Yeah.
But what is often distracting is there could be new business lines, right? New opportunities that are,
Great
and if
point.
you distract your team with all these new ideas, when 80% of the energy should be focused on just scaling what's working really well, it can be difficult.
Right. No, it's a great point. Tweaking was the wrong word because you're right. But new ideas and keeping new ideas coming can ultimately be a distraction when you do get a nugget right. Right. And I guess, how do you know when you actually have gotten the right product fit for the market? What's a way to
Look,
tell you
usually,
that?
usually it's your business results or your customers' reactions, right? When
Yeah.
you know that you've got something that really works when your business is growing quite well and your customers are referring you to other customers.
Yeah.
Like it's really straightforward. The higher the level of customer satisfaction and comfort and desire to refer you to other customers, you know you've got something that's really singing, right? And
Yeah.
then you do a heck of a lot more. Or how do you end up serving in that particular example? right? How do you end up serving more customers? If you've got something where you've got raving fans, right? How do you just find a way to get to more? And that's tricky, right?
Yeah.
In your business, right? You certainly have a number of clients that are thrilled with what you offer. Well,
Yep.
there's some combination of people on your team and processes that you employ to go deliver for them that they are thrilled. Well, if you wanted to serve 10 times the number of people and deliver the exact same thing, the people that are delivering that service today can't do it. So you have to exert, the share of your time, right, in your thinking to say, how do I take something that I know that this small group of people can't deliver to 10x the number of people, and how do I train others and bring them in to
Yeah.
be able to scale that
It becomes
service?
about the process, right? And
Yeah.
training around the process, optimizing. So last question on that, do most entrepreneurs that you've seen, are they able to do both? In other words, brilliant product idea and then stop developing that and start scaling the business?
It's interesting. They're completely different types of entrepreneurs, and you've seen some that have been immensely successful. If you look out in Silicon Valley, right, what Mark Zuckerberg did is often heralded by VCs as like, oh, why you would never want to have a founder step away from a business. And the
Yeah.
reality is he was very good. I would say that he leaned on Sheryl Sandberg immensely, right, to
Mm-hmm.
bring some of that structure and discipline in terms of how they operated. Right, Google was a different case where while the founders were deeply involved, they were relatively early on, and if you look at the metrics, it's pretty wild. You think of how big Google is now. They actually brought in a highly accomplished leader, Eric Schmidt, to be the chairman and CEO when they had about 100 million in revenue. You think of how
Yeah.
big they are right now,
Yeah.
right? And there's plenty of entrepreneurial ventures where the founders aren't bringing in kind of that talent at a much larger, with much larger businesses. And so I think while both cases highlights something that was a little bit different in terms of the role the leaders played, right? Mark stayed as the CEO the entire time, and Sergey and Larry stepped back a little bit but stayed involved, and one of them came back to be the CEO at a later stage of the business. In both cases, they were reliant on bringing people to the businesses that had some of the skill sets and experiences that they didn't, so they could scale appropriately.
Yeah. So love that. So you're right. Get the focus right, and then have the skills and training to get the process underneath it. Once you've got the focus right, to scale it and grow it from there. Well, all right. What else? I know we had a couple of things we talked about. One of them, just and you're great at it, communication. Consistently, right? And entrepreneurs, in a best practice, are they doing that as well as they should?
Yeah, look, on the communication front, I know we talked about it. So on the communication front, part of the fun of leading any business, and I describe this to many people, and some would say it sounds exhausting and daunting, but part of what I love about leading businesses, and when you get to larger businesses, the size of the different audiences that you need to communicate to are pretty meaningful. And so going through a day, you could be communicating with an investor, board members, analysts, customers, employees, and employees at many, many different levels and many different functions, right? Partners. Well, figuring out how you communicate in a way that actually constantly pushes the ball forward towards in the direction that you want to move the business, but actually resonates with each of those audiences where their level of understanding of any different element of the business is going to be different, right? So with a public company, you've got huge numbers of investors who sit outside the business, and while you share a fair bit of information with them, they don't have the ability to understand the inner workings of the business, and that's appropriate. Well, how do you communicate with them, and how do you communicate with a partner or a frontline employee versus a senior exec? And I love that puzzle. Like, how
Yeah.
do you actually have it all linked together where every interaction you're moving the ball forward towards your strategy, right? And look, it's an art, and it's kind of fun to do.
Yeah, it's an art, and across all of it, I guess the definition of success is the same, and the metrics you're using to track that success is the same. And public companies generally seem very good about doing that, I guess, because just they're more transparent. Large private companies are good at doing that. Well, last point here, just I remember when we were talking about advice to entrepreneurs from those who've run larger companies, public companies. Entrepreneurs often feel like they've got to make all the decisions themselves. And at
Yes.
some point, maybe early, that's important, but that becomes a trap. So flesh that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, look, I think it's incredibly important that you have the right advisors, and this is both kind of professional services that, you need the right lawyers and bankers and accountants advising you along the way, because it's just impossible if you have depth in all of these areas. And if you don't have the right advice, you can make some real missteps. I would also say just advisors that have experiences that you don't, and these could be formal or informal, right? It's great to seek out people that have experiences that you don't. It could be working with larger businesses, could be in different industries. But I find that the more people that you're engaging with that have perspectives that you can bring into your business, for me, right, I'm constantly kind of pulling from what's the best that I've seen at all these different places. And I feel like I had the luxury of doing consulting work for 7 or 8 years. And in consulting, you end up engaging with lots of different businesses, and you can see both how their leaders lead, but also many elements about how they operate the business. And so if you're constantly extracting the best from all of that, right, that's a wonderful thing. And then if you have the right set of professional services providers who can advise you through tricky things like regulatory matters or tax matters, right, you can certainly avoid missteps. And so it's worth kind of finding the best people to advise you.
Yeah.
Things will be a lot easier if you're not figuring it all out yourself.
No, it's great advice. We call it seeing around corners, right? So that you can, because each entrepreneur has their own blind spots, and having people who can help you accommodate that and not get trapped by it is so important. So that's awesome. Well, all right. So the last thing I thought we'd just pause on is just and talk about is just that difference between running a public company and running a private company. What are those key differences that you've come to appreciate?
In private equity, you have one clear owner who they are there, which is great, right? It's what any mutual fund manager or any other asset manager is trying to do. They're trying to maximize return for their investors. And so the mission is very clear, but because they have control of the business and ownership of it, and there isn't kind of all these other public investors, their ability to dig in and go much deeper is different. So you don't have to talk to a lot of people, but you're going to talk at a lot greater depth. And I would say private equity firms have a wide range of styles in terms of the depth that they engage. Some of them have portfolio teams that support the businesses. And they can be great assets because they're looking across many, many different businesses in their portfolio. And what I say to the folks on these teams is, if you've got the answer, the last thing I want to do is spend any time searching for it myself. And so if you've seen it in 5 other companies and it works, let's know every detail about that and we'll implement it. But that's completely different than how you'd engage with a public investor, right? It
totally makes sense. Just out of curiosity, so that you mentioned the demand for perfection on a quarterly basis, does that reduce the risk-taking ability, and does that reduce being able to make errors?
When I say perfection, it's actually on 2 different dimensions, right? So one is in all the materials that you share, like you can't get a word wrong, right? There's actually legal risk that you're taking if you mislead in any way, right? When you're private, if you made a misstep in a presentation, you're going through it and you're like, oh, you know what? Hey, just to let you know, that number's wrong. Or it's like, oh yeah, let's try to catch it next time. Right. And it's not a big deal. If we put out a public statement that had even one error, right, it's a big deal. And so there's time and process to get to that level of perfection in all the materials that you share. And so that's one element of perfection. I would say the second piece is, because you're sharing information on a quarterly basis, everything about your performance that you do share is dissected. And in a private context, look, you never want to miss your numbers. If you missed by a little bit and said, let's not worry about it because we know those deals that we were about to close, they're sliding in and we're going to close them the first quarter or two. That leads to a much lower kind of stress environment than you put out a quarterly earnings and you put that same note in there, but the numbers are slightly off. Right? What people expected, what analysts expected. And so I would say that's where kind of it's the perfection on delivery, even if it doesn't literally have any impact on the business's outlook. Minor deviations from what people expect can lead to outsized kind of changes in your stock price, which is tricky.
I'm always impressed how quality companies navigate, providing great information and insight, and yet at the same time, being in that space of imperfection that every business has. So, it's great, and giving guidance that's relevant, but yet at the same time, not getting into trouble. So, well, as we wrap, I would ask, would you rather work for a private company or a public company? But I know your answer is both, right? Because they both have different skills and elements, and you got that curiosity to make each one work.
Yeah,
But as
it all depends, right? Like what I like is finding really interesting challenges where I'm aligned with investors or board about what needs to get done, and that you can have a great team in place to go over deliver for customers. And so that can happen in a public context or a private context. And so I don't
Sure.
have one preference over the other.
Well, as we wrap then, so what is there any, I mean, you've given great advice here, but is there any just final thoughts you'd have for someone who particularly is a small business owner and kind of in their first 5 to 7 years of getting their business running? Any other thoughts or advice come to mind?
Yeah, look, I think the hardest thing to do is not to take on kind of too much, right? And in the last business that I was involved with, we actually supported many wealth management professionals, and
Mhm.
the bulk of those wealth management professionals would have businesses that were single digit to low double digit kind of millions in revenue. And it was extraordinary, right? With small teams, if you ask them, like, what are your priorities for the next quarter? And I think you and I have talked about this industry because you're in it, about all
Yep.
the different ways you can grow.
Yep.
And you'd get a list of, 7 things that we're going to go pursue. I was like, and I would like pause and say, wait, I think there's just a few senior leaders in your business. How are you all going to tackle 7 things? And so I would say prioritization and real focus. And it goes back to our earlier part of our conversation where figuring out, right, what really works. And so being pretty
Mhm.
methodical about narrowing the focus of things you're going to test, understand what outcomes you expect. And the hardest thing is once you've started something, is actually calling it off, right? If it's not
Yep.
working. Because what you end up doing is you pile on more and more on top, and that takes a lot of time, effort, and energy. And so what I'd say is for many earlier stage folks or people who are early on in launching a business is, pick a smaller number of things, make sure it's manageable for you and the team, but get really clear about what you expect the outcomes to be, and be comfortable kind of turning off and then adding something else to the mix that you're going to go give it a go.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, Chris, thank you. In a future episode, I'd love to get your thoughts on just the use of capital and raising capital that entrepreneurs can do, because I know you've seen that and advised that too. But we'll end it there. This has been very helpful, and good luck on the new business and new endeavor. And we'll stay in touch, and we'll see each other soon.
Great to be with you.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thanks.
All right, welcome back to the show. We've got Cannon and Claudia in the studio. Loved that episode with Chris.
Good.
So much great experience. Before we hop into the 3 or 4 things we want to highlight, what did you just think of the episode?
Well, what really stuck out for me is, we talked to a lot of CEOs and entrepreneurs, and he's so tenured and has so much experience that hearing how he has a name for all of his processes is really interesting. And obviously they work really well for him. So just hearing his methodology behind everything was really, really cool.
Well, you see somebody who's got incredible intellectual curiosity.
Right.
You got somebody who's got a lot of experience, but he's very adaptable about how he applies the methodologies. The other thing, just as an aside, I thought was cool was just how he builds trust in a period of high change. I mean, he talks about being very transparent in who he is, where he wants the organization to go, and giving access. It makes himself very accessible. And he reminded us, people want to be heard. And that's just so important in his leadership style, but something we can all benefit from.
Absolutely.
Well, great observation. I totally agree. So we'll touch on 3 quick things. The first one was just that concept of resetting. I said, what should an entrepreneur look to do in that first year when they're new in a period of change? And he said he preferred to think of it not in a calendar year, but in terms of a reset. And there were 3 steps to that. In one, hopefully you heard it in the episode, one was understand what's going on today, find out what's working well and what's not, do more of what's working well and less, in fact, none of what's not working well. Second, understand customer needs and how they're being delivered. And if, find those unmet needs and really build that plan to meet those. And third, just assess the team. Hopefully they're excited, they're motivated to over deliver,
right?
And the job of just building a culture to do that. Did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I loved the fact that he talked about how important the metrics are, and using those as markers for everything. And that really is so important, especially when you're looking to grow, which is obviously what he's always looking to do and really his specialty. But making sure that you have those right metrics and continue to measure them, getting those established at the start is so important.
Yeah.
And I love that he really highlighted that.
That's right. So once you understand, what's going on in your business, what's important to the customer and what are unmet needs, and getting the team behind it, measuring those just allows you to keep refining it. So I just thought that concept of the reset from what's in the past and focusing on what's right was so cool. Secondly, we spent a lot of time talking about that hypothesis-driven problem solving around that concept of where do you want to be 3 to 5 years from now, and how do you make sure you fail fast, is often what we say. I thought his McKinsey background was helpful there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hearing how he got his start at McKinsey, and in his first task, he's like, I don't have enough information to do all of this. I don't have all the data. And the lesson there was sometimes you don't want all of the data because it can really bog you down. And then you get mired in all of that and you get stuck in the details instead of the big picture and finding the solution that's going to work for everything and not something specific. So that was really interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and a lot of entrepreneurs have that, right? Where they're like, oh, I need more information. I need more perfect information, more complete information before I make a decision. And it was really refreshing to hear Chris talk about how that's actually not the best way to do it.
Right.
If you want to minimize mistakes, want to minimize resources and accelerate your time, do it this way. So cool. Thought that was great. And then the third thing just to highlight was once you do get that definition of where you're headed, and you see what works, what fits with the product market, then it's time to scale up, right?
Right.
And I didn't know if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously when you're scaling up, it's incredibly important to hone the skills that you have and to not get stuck in your incremental ideas, but really focus on the big one. But really it reminded me of Dave Sutton's episode, where he talked about that team that got you to 1 million may not be the team that gets you to 5 million. And it just kind of reminded me of always needing to assess your business to see where you're at and honing those skills to make sure that you're on that path for growth.
Well, and his point, great points there, and finding that repeatable process, right? When you make that pivot, it works. Now it's time to go all in and scale up and put 80% of your energy there.
Right.
And that, again, using that word counterintuitive, for some entrepreneurs, that's hard to do because they're such idea people. They keep throwing out ideas, right? They keep saying, all right, but what about this? And let's maybe consider adding this. And that ends up being a distraction to the team when you are actually in scale mode. So such a good reminder, for entrepreneurs to remember where they are in that process and use the right tool and the right focus to energize your team. And as Dave Sutton talks about, even progress your team as you hit key milestones. So again, so many other things we can cover in this episode. It was just a really high octane episode for those who are leading their organizations through change and wanting to do it in an efficient, productive way. So Claudia, thanks as usual for being on the show with me, and we will see you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Are you looking for more resources to help your business? Visit cornercappodcast.com for our free ebooks to help you plan for inevitable transitions in your business. Tune back in every other week for a new episode.